This is it. It's here. Season 2 has premiered, and I'm ready to get into it. I'm the Sovereign Dork, and I'm here to share the nerdy thoughts that are living rent-free in my head about Rings of Power Season 2. Let's jump straight in with the opening scenes and our big bad, Sauron. We start in Forwardwaith at the beginning of the Second Age, and I would say on the whole, I really appreciate this scene where we see Adar rise into power. I like that we're seeing Sauron manipulating the orcs, but I do have questions. First of all, I kind of thought Forwardwaith was always a frozen wasteland. Don't get me wrong, visuals in this scene are fantastic, and I'm not mad about it. It was just a bit of a question mark for me. I do think it's interesting that the goo critter we saw in the trailers was actually Sauron, rather than a creation of Sauron, which I had initially speculated. I'm still holding out for the whole Tree of Linden situation to be a manipulation of Sauron, but more on that later. Honestly, my biggest gripe was the fact that it seems like it took Sauron a really long time to regain his physical form. The books definitely do make it seem like it's a huge inconvenience. You know, there's paperwork. It's a whole thing. But I definitely did not get the impression it would take him 2,000 plus years to do it. We aren't given definitive dates in the show because they need to condense everything for practical purposes. But assuming we're supposed to be nearing the end of the Second Age, that is a long time to be living as a goo critter. This also begs the question about the experiments that we see at the beginning of Season 1. The beginning of the first season indicated that Sauron had been experimenting extensively on the orcs. But if he was killed by Adar at the dawn of the Second Age, that doesn't quite check out. Something that also caught my attention during the trailers was Galadriel saying he had been among us all along. Granted, she could have been talking about someone else, but the implication was clearly supposed to be Sauron. How he could have been among them all along if he was living his best life as a goo critter, I don't know. On the whole, though, I've been enjoying what we've been getting with Sauron, or beginning to get a taste of his true powers and abilities, namely his manipulative nature. Love it. Sauron, who is a manipulative monster with no remorse, is correct Sauron. And I love the entire montage leading up to Galadriel approaching the raft. It leaves you with the tantalizing question, how much of this did Sauron plan? He seemed aware that the water worm was there and appeared to be capable of controlling it to a degree, which seems to make it pretty unlikely the creature is a nameless thing, and more likely that it's something that either Morgoth or Sauron created. We're getting what I have really been looking forward to. Sauron pulling the strings, Sauron being the puppeteer. And unlike last season, we get to see it happening in real time, all the while knowing it's Sauron. We also get to see some of the advice that he gave Galadriel last season play out. He knows that Adar is most afraid of Sauron's return, and he is able to manipulate Adar by giving him a means of mastering this fear. As far as everything else that's been happening in Mordor, Stepdadar, aka Sam Hazeldine, has stepped into the role very well. He's definitely doing the character justice, and he had some pretty big shoes to fill. I also didn't have a problem with the little orc family we saw. Apparently that's been kind of a big deal. Didn't realize that. But in case anyone needed the reminder, orcs propagate the same way as everyone else. And while we don't really know how orcs act with their children, I suppose it's possible they do feel love for them, or at the bare minimum, there's no reason they shouldn't feel the orc equivalent. And we are definitely starting to see how the Siege of Eregion will take shape, and I'm here for it. I know I can't be the only one who was happy to see Waldreg gone too. The show did it pretty perfectly. Not only do I think the entire scene with Sauron and the Warg was really well done, I even think the Warg looks better than it did last season, but I also just love the irony of Waldreg alienating, betraying the very person he had been so eager to join in the first season because he doesn't know Sauron's true identity. Furthermore, Waldreg was so unimportant to Sauron that he didn't even bother dirtying his own hands to kill the guy. And I would agree that Waldrag is probably not worth dirtying your hands to kill, because honestly, even in a show with Sauron in it, Waldrag was probably the most detestable character. On to Eregion. Everything there has been playing out really well. From Sauron's manipulations of Celebrimbor with his very extra reveal of himself as Anatar, this is shaping up to be everything we'd kind of hoped it would be leading up to this season. We even get a little glimpse of Ithilden, which, along with one of the shapes we see in the opening title, indicates we are getting the Doors of Durin, which I know we have been awaiting with bated breath. Charles Edwards is doing a really great job. Between his performance and the writing, we're really getting a good look at Celebrimbor as a character. While pride is no small piece of his reasons for wanting to make more rings, I also really appreciate the other side we're seeing. He's a good person. He wants to help his friends, the dwarves, and it is his kindness that Sauron is manipulating as well as his pride. I also appreciated the scene where Celebrimbor shows that he clearly knows a lot more about dwarves than Anatar, by giving Durin the time to think about the offer rather than pushing, especially since Sauron revealed himself to be full of it by saying that Elrond was singing Durin's praises when Durin knows that isn't how Elrond operates. He never questions Elrond's friendship, only whether Elrond would be willing to say nice things about him to someone Durin has never heard of. And again, we're getting more of Durin is generally only rude when he has a point to make or for very specific reasons. Namely, he hates Anatar. It does seem like the ring the dwarves of Khazad-dûm will receive will be just as tainted as the other dwarf rings, which I'm a little bummed about, but what can you do? Especially when it is something that could have gone either way and still has a basis in the lore. It seems like the show is taking the whole untouched by Sauron thing literally. While he played a part in the creation of the Elven rings, it didn't look like he touched the Mithril long enough to taint it, but Charlie Vickers made a show of touching the Mithril while forging the Dwarven rings of power. Obviously, Durin and Disa are still couples goals, but I'm very glad we get to see a continuation of the differences between Durin III and Durin IV. It is Durin IV who is able to swallow his pride and approach his father for the sake of his people. Durin III mentions that what Disa might call stubbornness, other dwarves, aka Durin III, call strength. Durin IV apparently does not feel the same way. A bit of an elvish dwarf, no? I'm eager to see how the conflict between the two of them continues to play out. I do think it will be a case of the better dwarven traits exemplified by Durin IV, overcoming the more negative dwarven traits exemplified by Durin III. Hopping on over west to Lindon, as far as that plotline is concerned, I'm pretty happy with how it's going. I love that Galadriel is being held accountable for her actions in the first season and, very importantly, for trying to hide the identity of Sauron. Neither Gil-galad nor Elrond are willing to give her a pass. And I say this as someone who doesn't have a problem with the way Galadriel was portrayed in the first season. Again, I think they were intentionally making her unlikable so she could have a character arc. And the debate about the rings makes an interesting plot point, given the direction the show has chosen to go with them. Honestly, my biggest gripe about this portion was the fact that the tree healing was almost instantaneous, a little over the top, if you ask me, when all 3 rings were worn. But that could also just be the inherent bias I have against that whole plot point talking. But finding out that Sauron was the goo critter, and that goo critter looks very similar to that suspicious goo we saw on the tree, I'm still hoping that we're going to be getting something along the lines of, oh, it was all a big trick by Sauron. Just because I thought a lot of that whole plot was a little silly. I can also appreciate a little, I don't know if irony is the right word, but the fact that Elrond, who would later be a ring bearer, was so against the rings. I don't know. It has a certain appeal. We are all obviously very excited to see Círdan. Not gonna lie, when he first came on screen and said perfection exists only in Valinor, I said out loud, no sir, you are perfection. He looks great. and I have yet to see anyone complain about his performance for good reason. I like what he's bringing to the table. I think that the way they designed his character is perfect. He looks perfect. He acts perfect. This is all exactly what you would expect from a very wise elf such as Círdan. He's been around the block a lot of times. I'm loving the various philosophical exchanges between Elrond and Círdan. I love getting that rapport between them. I will say, though, when Círdan says to Elrond that he does his father proud, I actually think it would have been more fitting, at least in this instance, for him to say that Elrond did his mother proud, especially since he had to pull a bit of an Elwing, minus the death, with the rings. On a side note, did anybody else notice that Círdan looked a little younger after wearing the ring for a little bit? Probably other people have noticed that, but it's a really nice detail. Something I find interesting is we're getting a sense of just how strong Elrond's position is in Lindon. The guards immediately are on Galadriel because Elrond told them to. Even though he had disobeyed Gil-galad, the guy still insisted that Elrond needed to be part of the company with Galadriel in order to approve the expedition. The scenes between Gil-galad and Galadriel have been really, really good this season, and I'm not just talking about him holding her accountable for her actions. We see softer scenes, like the one where he says he should ship her off to the Etten Moors, and she asks him why he hasn't, and he says he's still considering it when he clearly isn't. His confidence in her, in spite of her mistakes, speaks volumes about their relationship and how it's thawed. They're confiding in one another about their visions. And so far, I'm liking the portrayal of the effects that the rings, or at least the elven rings, have on their ring bearers. Also, this may be a different point entirely, but I couldn't help but notice that Gil-galad has removed all of his other rings in favor of wearing only Vilya. Maybe it's important, maybe it's not. It just kind of stuck out to me because the dude usually is wearing quite a bit of bling on those fingers. We have also gotten our elves assemble team. Galadriel's been taken down even further to a lieutenant position, and I'm liking this kind of saltier Elrond. I'm perfectly fine with it. Is it a little petty? Sure. But I would say it's pretty deserved when one of your best friends in the world didn't want to tell you that she had become pretty good friends with Sauron unwittingly and has put everybody in danger, including Celebrimbor. And we know that Elrond is tight with Celebrimbor. Obviously, the Barrow-wights look fantastic, and I'm fine with the slight changes that they've made in order to be able to fit them into this. I know it's not technically lore accurate, but they look great. No one can deny that, and I was excited to see them on screen, even if it was for a much shorter period than I'd really anticipated. Or maybe it just felt short to me because I had been so excited to see them on screen. I also really appreciated that it was Elrond's knowledge of lore that was able to save everyone's butts, because if it hadn't been for Elrond, none of them would have known how to properly fight the wights. It is interesting that Elrond now has Nenya in his possession. I don't see him destroying it, even though I'm sure he's tempted to. I'm very eager to see the exchange between Adar and Galadriel now that she's been captured. They both have information on Sauron, and if they're honest with each other, then they could both use that to their advantage. But I don't see either of them being honest with each other or keeping any sort of pact that may or may not be made. And so we finally get to the men of the series. Only took us to the 3rd episode. We get Beric rescuing Isildur, which we all knew was going to happen. He comes from a long, proud line of horse girls. So Beric murks a few orcs, which was a little surprising and only further solidified why I do not trust horses and never want to stand behind them. We also got our nauseating scene with Shelob, which the soundtrack indicated we would get, And we have been introduced to Estrid, who will probably end up being Isildur's wife. Not only pretty obvious based on how the show is kind of setting it up, but dude's got to get busy if he's going to have heirs before marching on Mordor. Theo is acting like a broody teen, saying, "You're not my dad," and I'm like, yeah, Arondir actually wants to stick around. And hey, I'm not here to judge a teenager for how he mourns. I know it might seem a little suspicious that he had quickly thrown the fire onto the pyre, but it could have also just been him wanting to rip off the Band-Aid, so I'm not gonna hurl any stones there. Based on Theo and Isildur's foray into the forest to get Beric back from the Wildmen, Arondir is going to have to come to the rescue when we eventually see the Ents that we heard attacking the men. I don't really have much of an opinion on this piece of the story yet, especially since we haven't seen a lot of it. I mean, it's only been in the 3rd episode. But since we will be getting Ents, I suspect I will probably love it. I like that the rift has been repaired between them now that Theo has been rescued, but the exchange after that only made me even more worried that Theo is going to turn into a wraith. Calling him the Lord of Anything makes me think that that boy is going to get a ring. And I'm not super confident that he has learned his lesson after his whole debacle with that sword key thing, because if there's anything that we all know about teenagers, it's that it tends to take a few mistakes for something to sink in. Obviously, I love that we got Ents. If Isildur's a horse girl, I'm an Ent girl. I wonder if we're going to get more of them. I really hope we are, because frankly, my only complaint about the Ents was that there wasn't enough Ents in episode 4. Give me more Ents. But it was fun to see Isildur the plumber. Never thought I would get that, but, I can't complain now that I've seen it. And we also got a little nod towards the nameless things, which I had not anticipated. That horrible centipede thing in the mud that nearly killed Arondir and Isildur. I did think it was a little weird that Arondir made a joke about eating it, though. Frankly, maybe it's just me. I would not be eager to eat an eldritch monster. Just putting that out there. If I don't want to touch it with my hand, I would not put it in my mouth. Thank you. Another really strong storyline has been the Numenor plotline this season. We have a lot happening there, and given that we only see it in the 3rd episode, I'm surprised at how much they got in without making it feel rushed and condensed. I already loved Miriel last season, and I'm only loving her more this season as she shows true compassion for the grief that others are feeling. And I understand why people who are grieving may want to blame her for the deaths of their loved ones, but I also gotta think that some people gotta be smart enough to blame the orcs, right? Someone's gotta be smart enough to blame the orcs. And maybe want to go finish what Numenor started. Don't get me wrong, idiots exist everywhere. And pissing off the people who give you an island is a patently bad idea, so it's canon that there are some idiotic Numenorians, but I can still be disappointed in them as people for their idiocy. As much of the political blunder as it is for Miriel to wear white after Labor Day and fess up to a Palantir, I appreciate that she is choosing honesty over politics. It makes her kind of above that, and that's what we want with her. The eagle looked so done when everybody started chanting for Pharazôn. I have a feeling that we're going to be seeing the eagles leaving Numenor next season, now that their significance to Numenorians has been kind of established in the show. Who wants to bet that as soon as Pharazôn recommends they go to Middle-earth, everyone will suddenly be on board? It does make me wonder if Miriel walking into the ocean may not be a vision, but instead a kind of trial, or maybe it has something to do with a marriage to Pharazôn, which none of us are looking forward to, least of all Muriel. Lastly, we have our wizard friend and his proto-hobbits. I don't dislike having Poppy in the show, and I definitely don't dislike her as a character. But having her follow them and show up is part of my issue with having Harfoots in the show. I think the temptation is too strong to make it similar to what happens with the hobbits in Lord of the Rings, and to make a lot of references that are necessary. We do get more of the walking song, and I'm definitely not complaining about that. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a bop, it's a beat. But that's not really what we're here for in Rune. At least it's not what I'm here for in Rune. I love getting to see it on screen. I've looked forward to that for a long time. And I'm really liking the costume design for the Runic warriors. I like their clever alarm system with the well. Plus, makes sense that with water being a precious resource in this area, you're not going to let just anyone get to your well. The stranger is acting a bit more wizardy as he begins to remember bits and pieces of who he is. I know that there's been some speculation that the Dark Wizard in the show could be Saruman, but now that I'm seeing it play out, I'm not feeling that vibe. It seemed to me in the books like Saruman didn't turn to evil until late-ish Third Age, though I don't think we have an exact date. Just, whenever he started using that Palantir and chatting up with Sauron, I'm starting to feel more confident that these two are blue wizards, even though they were hinting at the stranger being Gandalf in the first season. Could have just been a red herring. We have finally gotten to the stores now in episode 4, much to my dismay, and they're shaping up to be a large part of this, which is kind of exactly what I was afraid of. Don't get me wrong, the music design for the stores is great. I love the design of their little village. I definitely could have done without Merrimack and Poppy oogling each other. And I could be recalling incorrectly, but if I remember, weren't the stores a river people? Seems a bit odd to me that a river people would be in the desert. And Tom Bombadil is there. I'm not as thrilled about that one either. And they're kind of dancing that line between revealing too much about Tom Bombadil versus keeping it mysterious. I'm hoping they lean more on the mysterious side, but who knows where this one's going to go. I am far more curious about this malady of the flesh referenced by Brack that is apparently afflicting the men of Rune. Could this be Sauron's doing? We know from the books that Sauron is capable of creating plagues, so that would check. It would be well within his abilities. One idea that I hope they kind of flesh out in Rune is the idea that the men of Rune are not evil, but rather victims of Sauron too. If this malady of the flesh is anything to go by, the men of Rune are not aligning themselves with this dark wizard because they have any desire to help him or they're part of this cult that he's amassing. Instead, it seems more like they're just desperate people looking for help wherever they can find it. And I appreciate that narrative far more than just the idea that, oh, there are evil men in Rune. And it's something that I appreciated in Tolkien's works when I was reading them. I believe it was Faramir who mentioned that mentioned his own sympathy for the men of Rune because of their circumstances not being so dissimilar from his own. And I believe this empathy for one's enemies is part of what sets Tolkien's works apart from others, especially given that he himself had to go to war and would have had to struggle with that very same concept of understanding the people who you're fighting, even if you don't agree with them, are human beings. So I really hope they choose to go in that direction, because that, to me, would just feel so quintessentially Tolkien, that it would really, really make a difference as far as my opinions on the show. I mean, don't get me wrong, I already like it, but that could bring it up to loving it and almost putting it with The Lord of the Rings as far as whether it feels Tolkien or not, if that makes any sense. But looking at everything on a whole, I would say so far, so pretty good. I'm buckled in for the next few episodes, and I'm ready for the emotional roller coaster that is going to come with Celebrimbor's storyline. I have been the Sovereign Dork, and thank you for dorking out with me.